February 1943, the Eastern Front. Across 1,000 miles of frozen steppe, German soldiers held positions they knew could not be defended. They held them anyway, not because of tactical necessity or because reinforcements were coming. They held them because an order had been given, an order that made retreat impossible, an order that overrode the judgment of every commander on the ground, from junior officers to army group leaders. In some sectors, Soviet forces had already bypassed these positions. The soldiers knew they were surrounded. They could hear the enemy moving behind them, but the order remained. Hold your ground. This was not a battlefield decision made in the chaos of combat. It was a directive from distant headquarters, signed months earlier, replicated across every front, enforced without exception. It forbade the one thing that had always kept armies alive in Russia, the ability to move. And it would determine the outcome of the war in the East, not through a single catastrophic battle, but through 1,000 smaller decisions that together made German defeat inevitable. The Eastern Front was not like other theatres of war. It stretched across distances that defied traditional military logic, over 1,500 miles from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. To put that in perspective, the entire Western Front in World War I, from Switzerland to the North Sea, could fit into a single sector of the Eastern Front with room to spare. These distances changed everything. Supply lines that worked in France collapsed in Russia. A truck convoy that could resupply a division in Western Europe in a day might take a week in the Soviet Union if it arrived at all. Roads weren't paved highways, they were dirt tracks that became rivers of mud in spring and autumn, and frozen ruts in winter. Railroads existed, but they ran on a different gauge than German trains. Every mile of advance meant converting track, building depots, establishing fuel dumps across terrain with almost no infrastructure. And then there was the weather. Winter on the Eastern Front wasn't an inconvenience. It was a strategic factor. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. Machinery froze. Weapons jammed. Men developed frostbite within minutes of exposure. Supply convoys disappeared into blizzards. Entire divisions could become combat ineffective simply from trying to survive. But summer wasn't easier. The steppe offered no cover, no shade, no water. Dust storms blinded advancing columns. Heat exhaustion claimed as many casualties as combat in some sectors. For the German army, survival here depended on one principle above all others: mobility. When threatened with encirclement, you withdrew. When a position became untenable, you abandoned it. When enemy forces concentrated against you, you fell back, regrouped and counterattacked from stronger ground. This wasn't cowardice, it was operational necessity. The military term was elastic defence. You bent but didn't break. You traded space for time, time for position. Losing ground didn't mean losing the war, it meant preserving your forces to fight another day. The Soviets understood this intimately. They had learned it during their own civil war across these same endless spaces. They had practiced it during the German invasion of 1941, withdrawing hundreds of miles while keeping their armies intact. Territory could always be retaken. Destroyed divisions could not. This principle, tactical withdrawal as a tool of survival, required trust. It required commanders on the ground to make decisions in real time, based on conditions that headquarters, hundreds of miles away, could never fully grasp. It required the flexibility to respond, and in 1942, that flexibility was taken away. The order came from Hitler directly, issued in the winter of 1941. Stand fast, no retreat without explicit authorization from the highest command. It was a response to crisis. In December 1941, German forces had reached the outskirts of Moscow, close enough to see the city's spires through binoculars. And then Soviet forces counterattacked. The German army, exhausted from 6 months of continuous combat, undersupplied and unprepared for Russian winter, began to fall back. In some sectors, the withdrawal was controlled. In others, it wasn't. Units broke contact, soldiers abandoned equipment, officers lost control. For a brief moment, the entire front seemed on the verge of collapse. Hitler issued the Stand Fast order to stop the retreat. Every unit was to hold its position regardless of circumstance. No withdrawal without his personal authorization. Officers who disobeyed would be relieved of command, or worse. And the line held. The front stabilized. German forces dug in, endured the winter, and prevented a complete rout. When spring came, the army was still intact, still capable of launching new offensives. Hitler believed the order had saved the Wehrmacht. He believed that willpower, rigid, unyielding defence, had stabilized the line when tactical withdrawal would have led to disaster. He believed he had discovered a fundamental principle of Eastern Front warfare, that ground, once taken, must never be surrendered. From his perspective, in distant headquarters, surrounded by maps and reports, but far from the reality of the battlefield, the logic seemed unassailable. But there was a critical difference between the crisis of 1941 and what would come later. In the winter of 1941, the Germans held a continuous front. Withdrawal risked breaking that continuity, creating gaps the Soviets could exploit. In that specific context, the order may have prevented disaster. But once issued, the order became permanent policy. It was applied not just to moments of crisis, but to every situation. Not just to prevent collapse, but to forbid any retreat whatsoever. It ceased to be a tactical response and became an ideological position. German soldiers do not retreat. Across every sector of the Eastern Front, in every season, under every circumstance, German commanders were now forbidden from authorizing withdrawal without approval from the highest levels of command. Approval that required requests to travel up the chain, be reviewed, debated, and decided upon by men who might be 1,000 miles from the front. Approval that often came too late, or never came at all. Flexibility, the very quality that had made the Wehrmacht the most effective fighting force in Europe, was removed by directive. And on the Eastern Front, where conditions changed by the hour and survival depended on the ability to adapt, this would prove catastrophic. The German generals understood the danger immediately. Men like Friedrich Paulus, Erich von Manstein, Walter Model, these were not inexperienced officers. They had commanded mobile operations across Europe. They had led the breakthroughs in France, the rapid advances through the Balkans, the lightning drives deep into Soviet territory in 1941. They knew what worked in modern warfare. They knew what didn't. And they knew that this order, if rigidly enforced, would lead to encirclement after encirclement. The logic was simple. If you cannot retreat, you cannot avoid being surrounded. And if you are surrounded on the Eastern Front, where distances are vast, supply lines are fragile, and the enemy has numerical superiority, you will be destroyed. But the dilemma these commanders faced was absolute. Obey the order and risk losing entire formations to encirclement. Disobey and face immediate dismissal, disgrace, or court-martial. Hitler had already relieved multiple senior commanders for unauthorized withdrawals. The message was clear. The order would be enforced. Some generals protested through official channels. They submitted carefully worded requests for clarification, hoping to find flexibility within the directive. They argued that stand fast could surely mean hold when practical, not never withdraw under any circumstance. But the responses they received left no room for interpretation. The order was absolute. Others simply waited, paralyzed by the contradiction between what the tactical situation required and what they were permitted to do. They watched Soviet forces concentrating, preparing encirclement operations, and knew with absolute certainty what would happen next. But without authorization to withdraw, they could only prepare their men for siege. A few commanders disobeyed. They authorized tactical withdrawals, gambling that success would justify their insubordination. Some were proven right. Their units escaped encirclement, lived to fight again. But they were still relieved of command. The army could not tolerate precedent that undermined the Führer's directive. And while the generals debated, requested, and waited, Soviet forces moved. The Red Army was learning. In 1941, they had fought with outdated tactics, rigid doctrine, and poor coordination. They had suffered catastrophic losses, but they were adapting, evolving, studying German methods, and they began to recognize something. If the Germans could not retreat, they could be surrounded. If they could be surrounded, they could be isolated, and if they could be isolated, they could be destroyed. The Soviets stopped trying to push the Germans back in broad frontal offensives. Instead, they developed a new approach. Identify weak points in the German line, concentrate overwhelming force, punch through, and encircle the strongest positions, because those positions, no matter how well defended, no matter how many men held them, could not withdraw. All the Soviets required was patience and time. Stalingrad was not the first encirclement, but it was the one the world could not ignore. By November 1942, the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus had fought its way into the city on the Volga River. The battle had become an urban nightmare, street by street, building by building, room by room. Every factory, every apartment block, every pile of rubble was contested. The offensive had consumed 5 months and cost tens of thousands of casualties. The Sixth Army was exhausted, undersupplied and overextended, but it held most of the city. Victory seemed close. And then, on November 19th, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, 2 massive pincer movements striking north and south of Stalingrad, targeting the weaker Romanian and Italian armies that protected the German flanks. Within 4 days, the pincers met. The trap closed. Nearly 300,000 German and Axis soldiers were surrounded. General Paulus immediately understood the situation. The pocket was large, roughly 30 miles across, but it was a pocket nonetheless. Soviet forces controlled every road, every rail line, every route out. His army was cut off, but in those first few days, a breakout was still possible. The encircling Soviet forces were thinly spread, still consolidating their positions. The Sixth Army was battered but still cohesive, still capable of coordinated action. A fighting withdrawal to the west, while costly, could succeed. The gap could be forced. Paulus requested permission to break out. The request was denied. The order came directly from Hitler. The Sixth Army will hold Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe will supply you by air until relief forces arrive. It was a logistical impossibility disguised as a command decision. The Sixth Army required a minimum of 700 tons of supplies per day to survive: food, ammunition, fuel, medicine. The Luftwaffe promised to deliver it, but the transport planes available could carry at most a fraction of that amount. Weather over the steppe was deteriorating rapidly. Soviet fighters were already hunting the supply routes. The Luftwaffe's own logistics officers knew it couldn't be done. Some tried to communicate this up the chain of command. The message was ignored. Paulus obeyed the order. He was a career officer trained to follow directives from above, and he believed, perhaps needed to believe, that relief was coming, that the promise of airlift and rescue was real. The pocket closed tighter. Winter deepened. Snow came, then temperatures that froze engines, weapons, and exposed skin within minutes. The promised airlift delivered a fraction of what was needed. Some days, only 50 tons reached the city. Some days, nothing at all. Soldiers began to starve. Rations were cut to a few hundred calories per day. Horses were slaughtered for food. Wounded men died from infections that, with proper medical supplies, would have been survivable. Ammunition ran low, artillery fell silent, tanks were abandoned when their fuel ran out, and still the order stood. No breakout, no retreat. Hold Stalingrad. By January, the Sixth Army had ceased to function as a fighting force. Units dissolved into bands of starving men huddled in basements and bunkers, too weak to resist. Soviet forces began compressing the pocket systematically, not in dramatic assaults, but through steady, methodical reduction. Block by block, the perimeter shrank. On January 31st, 1943, Paulus was promoted to Field Marshal, a rank no German officer had ever surrendered while holding. It was an implicit order: fight to the death or take your own life. Paulus chose a third option. He surrendered. He was captured in the basement of a ruined department store, surrounded by the remnants of his staff, starving and demoralized. Of the nearly 300,000 men encircled at Stalingrad, fewer than 6,000 would ever return home. Most died of starvation, disease, or exposure in Soviet captivity. This was not a battlefield defeat in the traditional sense. The Sixth Army had not been routed or outfought in open combat. It had been immobilized by directive, isolated by circumstance, and destroyed by a decision made far from the front. A decision that forbade the one action that could have saved it: retreat. And the worst part, the detail that haunted the surviving officers for the rest of their lives, was that in those first few days, the order could have been changed. The breakout was possible. The window existed, but it required authorization that never came. Stalingrad shocked the world. But within the German High Command, there was a more disturbing realization. This was not an isolated incident. The same pattern was repeating across the entire Eastern Front. At Beevor, 200 miles west of Moscow, German forces held a massive salient, a bulge jutting deep into Soviet lines. Strategically, it served little purpose. It tied down enormous numbers of troops. It consumed supplies at an unsustainable rate. It was vulnerable, exposed, and indefensible in the long term. Any rational assessment concluded the same thing: withdraw, shorten the line, free up reserves. But the order held them there. For over a year, from January 1942 to March 1943, the Beevor salient became a grinding war of attrition. Soviet forces attacked it repeatedly. German forces held, suffered horrific casualties, and held again. Estimates suggest over 1 million Soviet casualties were inflicted defending Beevor, but German losses were staggering as well. Hundreds of thousands of men, irreplaceable veterans, consumed in a battle for ground that had no strategic value. When the position was finally abandoned in early 1943, it wasn't because authorization had been granted. It was because Stalingrad had fallen and troops were desperately needed elsewhere. The Beevor salient had served no purpose except to bleed the German army. In Ukraine, in early 1944, 2 German corps, nearly 60,000 men, were encircled in the Kherson pocket. The situation was achingly familiar. Soviet forces had punched through weak points, surrounded strong positions, and closed the trap. German commanders on the ground requested immediate authorization to break out. The pocket was large enough that a coordinated assault could work. But approval was delayed. Hitler insisted that relief forces would break through from outside the pocket, that the encircled troops should hold and wait for rescue. Days passed. The relief forces made limited progress. Conditions inside the pocket deteriorated rapidly. When authorization for a breakout finally came, it was too late. The encircled forces launched a desperate assault through Soviet lines. Some escaped. Many didn't. Thousands were killed or captured. Equipment was abandoned. The 2 corps ceased to exist as effective fighting formations, and then came Operation Bagration. In the summer of 1944, Soviet forces prepared the largest encirclement operation of the entire war. The target, Army Group Center, defending Belarus and the approaches to Poland. German intelligence detected the Soviet buildup. Reconnaissance flights photographed the concentration of troops, tanks, and artillery. The signs were unmistakable. A major offensive was imminent. German commanders requested permission to withdraw to more defensible positions further west. Fallback lines had already been scouted. The withdrawal could be conducted in good order, preserving the army's strength while shortening supply lines. The request was denied. Army Group Center was ordered to hold its current positions. Every city was declared a fortress, a designation that meant it must be held regardless of circumstances. Commanders who suggested withdrawal were relieved. When the offensive came, on June 23, 1944, it was devastating. Soviet forces tore through the German lines. Not in a gradual push, but in multiple simultaneous breakthroughs that fragmented Army Group Centre into isolated pockets. The pockets were encircled, isolated, and systematically destroyed. In 3 weeks, 28 German divisions were annihilated, over 300,000 casualties. It was the single greatest military defeat Germany suffered during the entire war. Larger than Stalingrad, more catastrophic than any battle in the West. And it followed the same pattern. Encirclement identified, withdrawal requested, authorization denied, pocket closed. The order had created a system in which the German army could not adapt, could not maneuver, could not survive. Each encirclement didn't just cost men, it cost formations, divisions that had fought together for years, corps with irreplaceable experience, command structures that couldn't be rebuilt. And every time it happened, the German army became weaker, not just numerically, but structurally. The ability to conduct offensive operations, to respond to threats, to control the battlefield, it was eroding with each encircled pocket that was destroyed in place. Wars are not won by holding ground. They are won by destroying the enemy's ability to continue fighting. The German army that invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941 understood this principle intimately. It was a mobile, adaptive force built around the concept of maneuver warfare. Concentrate overwhelming force at the point of attack, break through, exploit the breakthrough with rapid advances, and encircle enemy formations before they can retreat. It didn't matter if you held every inch of captured territory. What mattered was destroying the enemy's capacity to resist. In the opening months of Operation Barbarossa, this approach was devastatingly effective. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Millions of prisoners were taken. The Wehrmacht advanced hundreds of miles in weeks. But this success depended on flexibility, the ability to concentrate, strike, withdraw if necessary, and strike again. German forces didn't hold static lines. They flowed across the battlefield, responding to opportunities and threats in real time. The no-retreat order fundamentally changed this. It transformed the German army from a mobile offensive force into a static defensive force. And on the Eastern Front, where distances were vast and the enemy had overwhelming numerical superiority, static defense was unsustainable. When the Sixth Army was destroyed at Stalingrad, Germany lost not just 300,000 men, but a full field army, one of the most experienced formations in the Wehrmacht. That capacity could never be recovered. When Army Group Centre was shattered in Operation Bagration, Germany lost not just territory, but the operational reserves needed to respond to crises elsewhere. There were no longer enough troops to man the front, launch counterattacks, or plug gaps when Soviet forces broke through. By 1944, Germany no longer had the reserves to replace what was being lost. Every pocket that closed was a resource that could never be recovered. The German army had not been outfought in some climactic battle. It had been systematically dismantled, immobilized by directive, encircled by design, destroyed in place. And on the Eastern Front, where survival depended on the ability to move, to adapt, to trade space for time, immobility was a death sentence. There are no monuments to the men who waited. They waited in frozen dugouts at Stalingrad, watching the perimeter shrink day by day. They waited in the Rzhev salient, knowing the position couldn't be held but ordered to hold it anyway. They waited in the Korsun pocket, in the Demyansk pocket, in dozens of encirclements across Ukraine and Belarus. They waited because the order said to wait, because retreat required permission, because the decision had been made elsewhere by men who could not see what they saw, who did not know what they knew. And many of them waited knowing with absolute certainty that no relief was coming, that the pocket would not be broken from outside, that the promised airlift would not deliver enough to matter, that authorization to withdraw would arrive too late or not at all. This was not heroism in the traditional sense. It was not battlefield valor or tactical brilliance. It was endurance in the face of inevitability. It was soldiers maintaining discipline while slowly starving, sharing the last of their rations, treating the wounded with no medicine, burning furniture to stay warm, holding positions that no longer had any military purpose except to obey the order they'd been given. And it was not cowardice when some finally surrendered. The soldiers on the Eastern Front did not lose because they lacked courage, skill, or determination. They lost because the structure above them, the system of command that should have protected them, had removed the ability to respond to reality. They lost because flexibility, the quality that keeps armies alive, had been forbidden by directive, and they lost knowing that it didn't have to be this way.